Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about Village Bench Studios' Killer Chambers, a viciously challenging platformer. Find out if I thought this put the laughter in slaughter, or if I thought it would be better suited to being a killer chamber pot. Sometimes, a brave lord just wants to sit down and eat a complete and unbalanced breakfast. Today is not that day, as our indomitable protagonist is rapidly introduced to a few key facts. The king is dead, the palace is in disarray, and if anyone acquires the crown, they will be coronated as the new king. Long live the new king! Thus begins our brave lord's, literally that is his name, noble quest to get himself crowned king for reasons. It's far from smooth sailing, however. The castle is loaded with countless killer chambers, loaded with traps, and a rather dour phantom by the name of Lord Graves standing in your path. Normally, this would be an incredibly daunting process ahead of you, but you're equipped with a peerless ability to come back to life when you're slain. I guess it's pretty easy to be brave when death is a minor inconvenience. And well, that's about that. The overall story doesn't take itself seriously at all, being absolutely chock full of puns, referential humor, and just leaning on the fourth wall here and there. You know, other little odds and ends like that. The levels start and end with small skits that mostly serve as vehicles for humor, though there are elements of an overall narrative being told across them. All in all, it's a fun bit of writing, though you shouldn't expect any deep plot out of it. Though the epilogue of the game does actually provide some answers, and a conclusion that feels altogether fitting with the overall tone of the game. Mechanically, I wasn't really sure what to describe the game as at first, but essentially, Killer Chambers is a platformer, albeit one which takes place in a rather small space with a distinct focus on trying your best to stay alive while being trapped in a room with absolutely lethal layers of traps. Overall, there's 5 worlds with their own distinct flavor of obstacles, each of which are broken up into a set of bite-sized stages. Mind you, I should emphasize that they are bite-sized not only due to their relative size, but also because your overarching goal is to survive for a relatively short period of time. It's just, you can expect to die a lot during that relatively short period of time, and every time you do, your progress in that room is reset, requiring you to learn how to perfectly clear each room, just to progress further into the game. That said, if you want to do more than just advance the main story, you have a secondary option at your disposal, which is to revisit these rooms. See, when you return to a room you've cleared, you'll have the option of doing it on a harder mode. And then an extremely difficult mode, which translates into a surreal sequence of death traps for you to dodge that makes the base mode pale in comparison. In fact, the majority of this video is from an extreme variant. The rewards are fairly nice though, as not only do you get an additional bit of dialogue, read punchlines, you're also able to acquire coins and gems for your trouble. Coins, your currency for acquiring consumable items, which you can use to make the various stages a lot less troublesome, albeit both being fairly specific in their usage and generally only usable once per level. Gems are a bit more difficult to gather in the necessary quantities to make purchases, but enable you to acquire new and fancy headwear, because the latest noggin accessories provide useful passive abilities while being worn, such as teleporting, being able to use 2 items in a stage, or getting yourself stuck in the ceiling. I'm a little hazy on that one, but hey. An interesting nuance to those abilities, however, is that you only retain them for as long as you're wearing said hat. So, if an arrow passes neatly above your head and plows your hat clean off, you're suddenly devoid of any awe-inspiring magic at your disposal. Still, not all stages are equal. For instance, a few times during the game, you'll encounter a corridor stage, which is strictly tied to advancing and can't be played in higher difficulties, which includes far lengthier puzzles which aren't tied to outlasting them, but rather rushing towards the end goal and not dying in the process. There's also the world bosses, which provide some of the most challenging puzzle segments in the game, as you need to discover and work within the patterns they attack while simultaneously figuring out how to counterattack them, those can actually end up being the lengthiest process by far. Given that each one plays out fairly differently, discerning just how to defeat each one can be trialsome, but the reward is a veritable deluge of gold coins and gems. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for dun dun dun, the curse, which is the game's punishment for dying. See, rather early in the narrative, you get cursed, which translates into you being dragged into a hellish eldritch challenge map whenever you die enough to trigger it. Difficulty-wise, it's not the steepest thing compared to later levels, but it's definitely a doozy early on in the game. And what's more, you're obliged to clear the curse stage if you want to resume making any progress on the main game. That's right, until you clear the curse stage, you can't do anything except the curse. And what's more, they don't actually give any reward for clearing, not even gold coins, which actually becomes incredibly annoying since a portion of the gameplay is more or less memorizing and adjusting to the various patterns in a room, and the curse serves to disrupt what you're doing for no reward. Which, given my memory is beans and the game was rather challenging in the first place, suffice to say I was incredibly irritated by this mechanic by the end of my adventures, and rather grateful I didn't see it too many times, as it's mostly just a time sink. Now, if I had to just describe the overall sound design in Killer Chambers, bouncy. Bouncy is definitely what comes to mind. I never thought being exploded into smears of blood would ever sound as upbeat as it does, but hey. Also, the overall sound effects of the stage provide a weird sort of rhythm in the background as well. Visually, I do appreciate Killer Chambers quite a bit, but here's where there are some nitpicks. Whilst the stages do look relatively clean and the obstacles are generally apparent, more than a few times I found myself killed by things that weren't immediately apparent. You can blame me for being a little blind if you want, but I wasn't really a fan that a number of my deaths came from biting the literal bullet from incredibly small and easy to miss projectiles. Thank you, Third World, for the bullet spewing fruit. The fourth also introduced a fire mechanic, which I also despised because those flames could actually obscure incoming projectiles, making it harder to properly react to obstacles. But hey, that's all said and done, we're now onwards to the finale. Up front, I am pretty terrible at games that highly rely on memorizing patterns, especially as they become increasingly intricate. There's a reason that whilst I cleared the game, I wasn't quite as eager to launch myself into a fray of 100%ing it and facing off against the most murderous of machinations it had to offer. And it wasn't that I didn't have fun, either, as I found myself enjoying the experience of mastering the various stages and the weird sort of relief I ended up feeling after I cleared the bosses or the extreme stages. And as I mentioned earlier, the dialogue and humor of Killer Chambers is great. It only enhanced the overall experience of making progress. No, beyond the simple fact that my memory is beans and that would be fairly time-consuming, the major factor here is that I have very little inclination to be thrown into the curse rooms over and over and over again. Because to be fair, it was generally the boss rooms and the harder variants of the rooms which saw me dying in excess enough to trigger them. Whilst in total I only saw some, perhaps 7 or 8 at this point, I rather quickly grew to dread their appearance, especially given that some of the boss encounters in extreme difficulty rooms did an enormously good job of throwing me into that wailing void. Mostly because every venture in more or less translated into me losing progress on the flow I'd established with the current stage, and used up my time with no return. I mean, the occasional occurrence of hazards, which were incredibly difficult to adapt to unless you'd already gotten annihilated by them, was also less than stellar, as were the few obstacles that were tricky to see due to graphic reasons. But honestly, given their relative sparseness, and the fact that I didn't delve too much into the extreme mode of those worlds, I'd still say this game's a hit for me. And this is coming from someone who doesn't normally mesh with these kind of titles. I generally found it to be a rather interesting way to spend a few evenings, and for people seeking to master the game, there's going to be a lot of content to master, as long as you have the threshold for frustration to match. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, podcasts, or our Monday TTRPG content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord. You can click the link in the banner or the description so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we have a coffee running now to help supplement funds for our lovely editor and make sure we can continue to provide quality content. Again, check the description plus the banner for dem links. Anywho, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.